It's very cool to be back here. I love the Catskills, and I love Burroughs, even though he's not a topic today. He's nowhere near our topic today. And I love Gould as a topic, and Pratt is a very interesting fellow. My biography of Gould, Dark Genius of Wall Street, was notable. The key theme was to debunk a lot of the urban legends around Jay Gould and get to the real brunt of things with him, what he did, what he didn't do. The United States has a rich tradition of turning many of our greatest entrepreneurs and innovators into whipping boys, you know, whether it's Andrew Carnegie and Frick, or John D. Rockefeller, or Jay Gould, or Jeff Bezos. If you build something new and unique and very dynamic that really enlarges the economy in a significant way, there inevitably seems to be some sort of dark shadow that enters your life, whether deserved or not, you know, and thus, you know, Gould was famously described by Joseph Pulitzer as the most sinister figure ever to flit bat-like across the vision of the American people. That's saying something, you know, that's, that's pretty, you know, he wasn't Joseph Goebbels. Specifically today, I want to talk about, since we're in Pratt's bank or house, I want to talk about two widely misunderstood and mistold stories related to Gould and related to his relationship with Pratt. Gould was 16 years old. He was born in 1836. He was 16 years old when he first encountered Pratt. And Pratt was 46 years Gould's senior. He was about the age of Gould's father. And of course, Pratt was one of the wealthiest men in these mountains at that time in 1852. And Gould was a struggling young man from a very modest background. Pratt and Gould was a surveyor at that time, was his chief occupation. And he was working at that time in 1852 on a map of Ulster County. There's a very famous map made a few years later by Gould of Delaware County. But the first map he made was of Ulster County. And he encountered Pratt in that endeavor because Pratt and one of his partners, one of his many partners, co-owned a tanning outpost in Sampsonville in Ulster County. So they first met through that. In January of 1853, once the Ulster Map project was finished, Gould wrote to Pratt, whom he was obviously interested in cultivating, to try to entice him to finance a Greene County map. Pratt was not interested in doing that, but after their conversation, he was somewhat impressed with Gould, this hungry young man who was obviously quite smart as well. And Pratt promised Gould that he would keep him in mind. Writing, Gould had a boyhood friend who remained a friend for the rest of his life, J.W. McClaney, who had been raised in Roxbury. And reminiscing in the 1890s, well after Gould's death in 1892, McClaney remembered this chilly, rain-soaked spring morning in 1856, when this old gray-haired man arrived in Gould's hometown, arrived in Roxbury, and loudly was asking around town for Gould. He didn't know where he lived or where he could find him, but it's not that big a place. So, and he introduced himself as Colonel Pratt, and he said he wanted Gould to do a survey of his farm. So in the coming weeks, Gould came over to here and did his survey of Pratt's acres. And as an aside, let me say, it's very interesting to me, if you ever go to Jay Gould's mansion, Lyndhurst, down in Tarrytown on the Hudson River, this palatial, almost castle-like house, and go into Gould's fairly small home office, roughly half the size of this room. There's his desk and his bookcase, and propped against the wall, right there, next to the desk, is his old survey gear, and that's where he kept it. I think perhaps to remind himself where he came from. And it's still there to this very day. All of the, if you ever go, all of the furnishings in that house are original to the Goulds. The house remained in the family until 1961, when Jay's youngest daughter, Anna Gould, passed away, and she left the house to and all its contents to the National Trust for Historical Preservation. And no changes had been made, you know, in the previous 50, 60 years. So just FYI if you ever go. So he surveyed Pratt's acres here, and he obviously and quite consciously tried to, there's no better phrase, butter up Pratt, cultivate Pratt, you know, this very wealthy, successful guy. To the extent, at one point, of even proposing to write Pratt's biography, which surprisingly, given Pratt's ego, he didn't go for. I don't know why. But nevertheless, it never happened. However, what Pratt did do was he hired Gould, commissioned him to be, and I can relate to this, a ghostwriter. Pratt was a public figure. He made a lot of speeches. He published a lot of public letters on various topics. And Gould stepped in to write these for him. I can relate to that because I do a lot of ghostwriting for a lot of hedge fund people, you know, down on Wall Street. And that's currently my bread and butter, so. So they got to know each other better through this process. It's interesting to me because, you know, John Burroughs, you know, became a well-known writer, and Gould became notable for other things. However, the first guy to make money from his pen was Gould, both with the writing for Pratt and for his History of Delaware County, which he wrote and published in 1856. He was a published author long before Burroughs, probably a decade before Burroughs, who actually wanted to be a published author. Anyway, like a lot of other Catskills tanners, by the mid-1850s, Pratt had shuttered his tannery here several years earlier. A half a century of heavy production had pretty much denuded the Catskills of virtually all of the hemlock trees that were available, which were required for the process of tanning leather. So the operations, could not operate without this material. And many operations moved to Pennsylvania, towards the Poconos and the Lehigh Valley, which were virgin areas, rich in hemlock forest, just as the Catskills had been in 1805. And Pratt himself had invested in one of these with a partner in Aldenville, Pennsylvania, as early as 1849. Against this backdrop, Gould sought to interest Pratt, very precociously. Gould was, barely 20 years old. Gould sought to interest Pratt in starting another tannery operation with Gould as a partner. And Jay told Pratt that he believed there was promise in the as yet largely untouched tracts of hemlock rumored to lurk between the Lehigh and Delaware rivers in Pennsylvania's Luzerne County. Now, Pratt commissioned Gould in 1856. He commissioned Gould to go down there and just look around and report back. So Gould spent a couple of weeks hiking through the woods as if he was John Burroughs or something, scoping out properties and tracts of land and such, and carrying his compass and his surveying gear so that he could tell where he was, the sun sights and all. And finally he found what he was looking for. It was like as if he was striking gold in California or something. It was like, oh, this is the place. So Gould took Pratt to the site a few weeks later and showed the old guy around, and Pratt, who knew his tanning business like nobody else, realized it was a good location too, and thus convinced Pratt on the spot formed a 50-50 partnership with Gould, who, as I mentioned, was just 20 years old, and basically to use a worn-out phrase, didn't have a pot to piss in. The contract between them no longer survives, but it's clear that Pratt's main contributions were to be, number one, cash, because Gould certainly didn't have any, and number two, his expertise and experience and advice, because Gould also did not have those. And in letters, Pratt made it very clear that the day-to-day responsibility for the operation, into which he would eventually sink $120,000, $1856, back when it used to be real money. The day-to-day responsibility was to be Jay's alone. And Pratt would be available for consultation and advice. He would answer all the questions that Jay had about managing the plant, acquiring raw pelts, marketing the finished leather, the whole business side of things. But Jay was the man who would have to make things happen on the ground. Perhaps that's why the name of the settlement that they began, to this day, it's now a township, is Gouldsboro. Now, at the start of their enterprise, The relationship between Pratt and Gould was, that of the accomplished older sage nurturing the grateful, doting student who was, just feeling so blessed to be operating under the halo of the master. And Jay seems at first to have sincerely welcomed the steady stream of advice that came in letters, almost daily letters, from this house right here. As an example, he was completely submissive when Pratt informed him that the pelts for tanning and all the Pratt and Gould's finished leather were to be acquired and disposed of through a Manhattan brokerage firm of Corse and Pratt, a firm that was half owned by Pratt's son, George. He also acquiesced immediately when Pratt was a compulsive tinkerer who always sought to be on the cutting edge of technology, such as it was back then. So he also acquiesced when Pratt decided the Gouldsboro plant should be the very first in the nation to perfect a new tanning technique, which he'd recently read about as a theory in a trade journal. And this was called the wet, I wrote this down because it's so weird, the wet spent tan bark process. Say that 3 times fast. And it called for the large chunks of wet refuse bark normally discarded in traditional tanning operations to be burned as fuel and to drive a steam engine which would power the plant. Usually, and this is why the Pratt tannery was here, usually you had the flowing water to turn the mill and generate the power for the Pratt believed that, given this resource, which was great in theory, the Gouldsboro tannery would be able to run year-round rather than have the pause in the severe winter when the flow of water would freeze and the mill wouldn't turn. That was the theory. And now Gould, it must be said, at the same time that this technology was brought in and the staff was asked to perfect it, Gould at the same time was somewhat removed. He wasn't particularly interested in day-to-day details of managing the tannery, even though he was supposed to be. He mostly left these to capable lieutenants, many of them imported from Prattsville. Pratt sent a lot of talent from here down to Pennsylvania. Jay really preferred to occupy himself with logistics. He was a real data-driven guy. Throughout his life, he was data-driven. In detailed letters to Pratt, he itemized and explained his organization of the tannery's inventory system and his method of handling cash accounts and all this minutia. But nevertheless, the wheels toward profitability of this enterprise turned very, very slowly. The startup phase of the operation and all its land clearing and construction had, of course, consumed vast amounts of capital. And Jay regularly had to draw on Pratt for funds. And no income whatsoever, let alone profit, could be anticipated until the tannery was, obviously, until the tannery was operating at capacity. And capacity was to prove elusive, to say the least, for many months, as the master tanners at Gouldsboro experimented and labored and tried their best to refine the wet, spent, tan bark process. I'll never learn that. And it did not help matters when the steam engine produced for the tannery failed shortly after delivery, as did its manufacturer before a replacement engine could be obtained. So, there was a lot of bad karma here. And Gould wrote to Pratt at that time, slightly tongue-in-cheek. He's starting to rebel a little bit. He wrote to Pratt, "Although you know far more than any man in the country about these matters, I am inclined to think that my original suggestion of building a water wheel as a backup to the more modern plan may have saved us time, expense, and frustration." And this is like some dial it back 40 years. It's like some novice train engineer telling Gould how to run a railroad or something, But while his staff dealt with problems at Gouldsboro, Jay made a lot of trips down to Manhattan, where he quickly realized the real action in the tannery business happened. It was in a leather district that was called the Swamp. This part of town, it ran down Spruce and Ferry Streets on the east side, just south of where City Hall is today, was the Swamp. And it had once literally been a swamp, a mosquito-ridden quagmire. And it had been a place to which 17th century tanners had retreated when their neighbors complained about the foul smells, and in fact, actual stench that accompanied the practice of tanning. So they stuck it out in the swamp. Zadok Pratt himself wrote in 1853, this became a very important economic hub, the swamp. And in 1853, Pratt wrote, "The swamp is to the tanners what Wall Street is to the financiers. Here leather merchants such as," that's what he wrote. And it was in this neighborhood where all the leather merchants, such as George Pratt's operation, Corse and Pratt, did a brisk business with importers and exporters and shipping firms, bargaining to get the best quality hides for their clients and at the most competitive prices. And then the same broker would in turn sell the tanners finished leather, negotiating the highest prices possible, and do this all on a commission basis. So the brokers made money on both ends of the process, buying the hides for one set of customers, and then selling the hides and taking a piece, usually 5% of every transaction, on either end of the deal. And Gould, who had obviously had a nose for this kind of thing, quickly realized that this was where the money was, He wrote a letter to his father in 1857, so he was 21 at this point. And he said, "I've come to realize that it is the merchants who command the true power in the industry. The tanner appears to make the greatest share of capital, but he merely processes that capital. His expenses being extensive, his risk real, and his labor quite heavy. The shippers deal with the next largest sums, but again have extensive expenses and much work to do. The brokers, meanwhile, take what seems the smallest share, but is in fact the largest. Theirs is nearly pure profit made on the backs of the shippers and the tanner, never their hands dirtied."
Still the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I work for some of these guys on Wall Street. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So the tannery is struggling along, yet to make a profit, and we move it from 1856 to 1857. 1857. Nobody in business anywhere in the United States of America enjoyed 1857. During the summer and autumn of that year, a financial panic swept the country, the Great Panic of 1857, appropriately named, this ended 10 years of boom times in the wake of the Mexican-American War. 10 years of unstoppable economic expansion came to a halt like that, just as we will if there's no debt ceiling deal. The immediate event that touched off the panic was the August failure of the New York branch of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, which was a major financial force that collapsed following what wound up being realized to be massive embezzlement. And on the heels of this disaster, numerous British investors removed large sums from American banks. They just didn't think it was safe. And at the same time, a fall in grain prices hurt rural economies. And the pileup of manufactured goods, because nobody was spending money in warehouses, it led to massive layoffs. And with the fall of shipping revenues, several railroads failed, as did a score of Western land speculations associated with the development of future railroads across the country. And thousands of investors across the landscape faced ruin. It was very, very tough times. And general confidence received another shake, I guess you'd call it, in September, when 30,000 pounds of gold being transported from the San Francisco Mint to the eastern banks went down with the SS Central America. Yeah, sank, causing some to question the government's ability to back paper. During that year, nearly 1,000, not quite 1,000, but almost 1,000 Manhattan merchants across all trades and disciplines declared bankruptcy. It all happened before the end of December. And the combined total losses for all these Manhattan merchants, and this is just Manhattan, okay, was $120 million, $1857. As the economy crumbled, so did this warm and fuzzy relationship between Pratt and Gould. Of course, Gould could hardly be blamed for either the slow start of the weird processing method that Pratt wanted, or for the panic of 1857. But Pratt, anxious for profits that continued to fail to appear, nevertheless clearly began to reconsider his young protege. Simultaneously, as Gould learned more and more about the business and became increasingly confident of his own skills and knowledge, he began consulting Pratt less often and began deferring to him much less willingly. And Pratt's formally encouraging letters were no longer so nurturing as they were dictatorial and moving into the realm of real micromanagement. But they soldiered on. Early in the spring of 1858, in a move that he knew Pratt would not like, Gould, at age 22 now, broke off relations with Corse and Pratt, replaced them with one of the swamp's largest and most influential brokerage houses, that of Charles M. Loop, L-E-U-P-P and Company. And there he negotiated terms that allowed him to acquire hides and sell leather on a much improved profit margin than he'd been able to with Corse and Pratt. Now, at this juncture, the panic was over. The Gouldsboro plant was finally up and running. And so at this juncture, the amount of business awarded to Loop and lost by Corse and Pratt was considerable. Despite what the dissatisfied Pratt continued to classify as Gould's bungled management, the Gouldsboro tannery was destined to produce no less than 60,000 sides in 1858. This number rivaled the output of Prattsville tannery in its best year. So say what you will about Gould, he was always a good administrator of business. He always made it happen. In a September letter to Pratt, Gould informed the colonel that hides were going through the tannery at a rate of 300 sides per day, which was impressive for that period. On the strength of these figures, a somewhat grim but realistic Pratt, satisfied with the plant's output but not with his per-side return, continued to advance funds as necessary, while also clearly pondering his options. Gould and Pratt were no longer in love. The honeymoon was over. And they were both developing roving eyes. It's an interesting fact that Pratt, in his later years, hardly ever spoke of his partnership with Jay Gould. In a book entitled The Chronological Biography of the Honorable Zadok Pratt, a mistitled 1868 publication that is far more autobiography than it is biography, Pratt filled page after page after page with the names of dozens of partners in tannery enterprises through the years. But nowhere did he mention Gould, Gouldsboro, or Pratt and Gould. I should add here that Jay himself only mentioned publicly Pratt and Gould once. This was during Senate testimony many, many, many years later, when he summarized the enterprise in one flat sentence in response to a direct question. And the quote is, "We carried on the business for a while, and then I bought Mr. Pratt out," and period, end of story. That Pratt came away from the partnership feeling ill-used can be verified by letters he wrote after the fact and by the somewhat bitter reminiscences of his daughter, Julia Pratt Ingersoll. That was her married name. That's why such Pratt descendants as currently endure are heirs to the Ingersoll Rand fortune. And the popular tale is that somehow amid all this, the young Gould robbed and defrauded a guileless and easily bamboozled elderly Pratt, as so many previous biographers before me have suggested. But this cannot be proved with the existing documents and seems, when all the facts are considered together with the existing documents, certainly not to have been the case. The popular folklore of the Pratt and Gould dissolution was first recounted in a potboiler biography published just weeks after Jay Gould's death in 1892. And this story has been routinely regurgitated by dozens of biographers since then. The story goes like this. Supposedly, throughout 1858, Gould consistently diverted funds from the Pratt and Gould accounts. As the tale has it, he used some of Pratt's money to speculate in Lehigh Valley lands and to open his own bank in Stroudsburg, where he subsequently deposited even more Pratt and Gould capital for siphoning into his various insidious side ventures. As one of these mediocre Gould biographers put it, Robert Warshaw, quote, "The tannery was doing a rushing business and was always at capacity. Profits, however, were very small. Then Pratt came on one of his rare visits and went over the books, which he found to contain very original bookkeeping." For these reasons, according to the accepted story, a disgusted Pratt announced to Gould during the Christmas season of 1858 that he wished to close their partnership. Here, however, are the facts. The town records of Stroudsburg and the state banking records of Pennsylvania reveal no bank started by Gould and no bank on the board of which Gould sat existing in 1857 or 1858. Local land records in the region of Stroudsburg do show some land purchases in Gould's name. These transactions, however, had a small investment value of not more than $4,000 or $5,000, which is roughly the amount Gould is known to have possessed after some small land speculations in his native Roxbury. Another gap between, if he was going to rip off Pratt, it wouldn't have been for 4,000 or 5,000 Jews, Another gap between the folklore and reality is the image of Pratt as this naive old man taken to the cleaners by a young and crooked upstart. Pratt had not amassed his fortune by being a moron, and he was known to play fairly sharply himself in business. In fact, there is every indication that the breakup of Pratt and Gould represents the first time Pratt failed to get the better of a junior partner, which is maybe why it didn't make it into his book. Pratt, as might be expected, sought to improve his position by ousting his partner at a bargain price. With Pratt having the largest interest, he said to Gould, "You must either sell or buy. We're going to break up this partnership one way or the other." More precisely, the terms laid down by Pratt were these. Pratt would buy out Gould for $10,000, or else Gould must buy Pratt out for $60,000. In an offhand manner, Pratt told Gould he could have 10 days to think about it. Reason suggests, math suggests, basic accounting suggests that Pratt's offer to sell his share for $60,000 was a canard, pure and simple. Pratt had sunk $120,000 into the operation. Therefore, he would have offered to sell at half that amount only if he were convinced there was no way Gould could come up with a scratch. Big mistake. The actual deal that Pratt meant to force was Gould selling out for $10,000. This transaction, had it gone through, would have allowed Pratt to purchase Gould's 2.5 years of full-time managerial devotion, not to mention Gould's rights in the enterprise, very cheaply. But Pratt, who perhaps should have known better, he certainly did later, had underestimated his young colleague. In the time allowed to him by Pratt, Gould traveled to New York Swamp, where he struck a fast deal with an enthusiastic Charlie Loop, the broker, and Loop's somewhat less than enthusiastic partner and brother-in-law, David Lee. Loop and Lee agreed to acquire a 2/3 stake in Pratt and Gould for a total price of $60,000. Returning to Prattsville, right in the living room here, I suspect, Gould, I would imagine flabbergasted Pratt when he exercised his option to buy the firm, offering letters of credit from his new partners as surety. And Pratt had no option other than to accept. The deal was finalized by the end of January 1859, and it left Pratt with a $60,000 loss overall. Simultaneously, it left Gould with a 1/3 stake in a thriving tannery and an alliance with one of the Swamp's most prestigious brokerages. And so, in short, what so many previous writers have described as Gould's first great swindle was, in fact, his first great coup. Given the facts, Pratt's utter silence in later years regarding his partnership with Gould, at the end of which Pratt wound up bettered by a man barely out of his teens, begins to make sense. Now, what of Gould's new alliance? More particularly, what of Charles Loop, who was the senior partner to his brother-in-law Lee? In the firm, David Lee basically just served as in-house counsel. He was a lawyer, and it was Loop who ran the show, ran the day-to-day operations, and had the final say on what happened. Now, unlike the rustic Pratt, with whom Loop had done much business in the 1820s through the 1840s and early 1850s, the 52-year-old Loop prided himself on being a very urbane gentleman, a lover of fine things, a patron of the arts. He had a $150,000 mansion at the corner of Madison Avenue and 25th Street in Manhattan. And there he raised his 3 daughters after his wife's untimely death. The house was one of the handsomest in New York at that time. Loop cultivated writers such as journalist and essayist Nathaniel Parker Willis, and artists such as the Hudson River painter Jasper Cropsey. He had people like these who were his friends. He was a member of the Century Club and numerous artistic societies. He took a leading role in several charitable institutions, most notably the Episcopal Church and the New York Society Library. All told, he was a central figure in New York's social, financial, and artistic aristocracy. He was, one of the big men on campus. Were he alive today, we'd call him a player, right? Now, in business, Loop had long been known as quite the conservative. He was a solid citizen who calculated his risk very carefully and placed only the safest of bets as far as investments went. Therefore, one is initially at a loss to explain his move to purchase a controlling interest in the Gouldsboro concern, and I'll tell you why. The leather merchants of the swamp generally made it a rule to not invest directly in tanneries. Thus, they avoided overt conflicts of interest that might complicate their buying, selling, and bartering, which makes complete sense. By going with Gould, Loop risked alienating the numerous other tanners on whom he relied for trade, who would now have cause to question the Loop firm's impartiality in dealing. So why did the normally conservative Loop take himself into the Gouldsboro enterprise? Few understood at the time what Loop's junior partner and brother-in-law, David Lee, did. And what Lee understood was that Loop was mentally unhinged. Lee would tell friends in later years that he'd noticed severe changes in Loop's demeanor as early as 1853, when the leather merchant began exhibiting wild, albeit occasional swings from high elevation to deep depression, what we would call mania these days, bipolar. They didn't have lithium back then. Things had grown so bad and the swings so frequent by mid-1856 that Lee took the reins of the firm for a time, sending Loop off to travel and, reconstitute himself. But that convalescence ended abruptly amid the panic of 1857. In that environment, David Lee found himself over his head trying to keep this business afloat. And no matter how crazy he was, Loop was the guy who knew the business inside and out. So Loop came back into the picture. So we can see the maniacally optimistic speculator who agreed almost instantly to bank Gould against Colonel Pratt soon enough collapsed into nervousness, second guesses, and doubts. Lee said later that he should have guessed that his partner was, quote, completely insane, unquote. He wrote to a friend, "That Charles was unsound in mind I have seen for a good while, but how terribly in this have we all been deceived by the wonderful cunning of lunacy." What a great phrase. The wonderful cunning of lunacy. Because of Loop's mental state, the business arrangement between Gould and the firm, which promised to be complicated from the outset, became even more so. Wishing for reasons of both practicality and public relations to distance themselves from direct management of the Gouldsboro tannery, Loop and Lee signed a working agreement with Jay in February of 1859 that called for Gould to act as the sole known partner of the concern. And although Loop's company would continue to underwrite all of the Gouldsboro tannery's credit going forward, thus allowing Jay to issue two named paper for which he, Loop, and Lee would be equally liable. The plan as originally proposed called for Jay to make all decisions concerning the running of the Gouldsboro plant, which also made sense. I mean, he was doing it successfully. As Gould explained it later, it was Loop and Lee who wanted their involvement kept quiet, for they feared that knowledge of their interest in manufacturing would affect the standing of their paper in the market. Straightforward. As might be expected, the management agreement called for Loop's firm to continue to serve as Gouldsborough's merchants, just as they had already done for more than a year. The firm's standard commission schedule of 5% for the purchase of hides and 5% for the sale of leathers remained unchanged. Interestingly, however, the contract obligated Loop to deliver a monthly minimum of only 1,800 sides, less than half the 5,000 sides per month that he had provided previously to the Gouldsborough operation. Now, perhaps Loop and Lee, who were already carrying paper for the $60,000 they'd invested, thought by this method to limit their overall exposure with regard to the Gouldsborough enterprise. Perhaps as well, it suited Loop and Lee's purposes in their representations of other tanneries to cut back production at the Gouldsborough facility, thus upping the demand and pricing for tan sides overall. Both these elements of the business calculus were probably, I would say most certainly, in the air, as was Loop's increasingly impaired mental state. And all three of these factors combined with Jay's growing penchant for, maximizing his advantage, which is what you do in business, and cutting legal corners, all of these things would quickly collide. Gould read the 1,800 side minimum as just that, a minimum. He proceeded in 1859 with going into the year with no idea of restricting production at Gouldsborough, a policy that, although it might have served the purposes of Loop and Lee, could only hurt Jay's position. And Jay was, throughout his career, aggressive and expansionist by temperament. It was what he did. And Gould argued to Loop and Lee, after several months of tolerating low production, that he could and should ship 21,000 finished sides during July, August, September of 1859, and that he would increase production to 8,000 sides in June. Making his case for maximum production, Gould stated the simple math of static costs quite simply as if educating a nitwit son. We can tear 90,000 sides, he wrote, cheaper pro rata than we can 60,000 at the same tannery. The same men oversee it so that the cost of supervision is not increased. Business 101, manufacturing 101. When Loop and Lee proved unreceptive to this logic, Gould countered by reminding them that he had, in the past 6 months, endorsed notes for Loop and Lee associated with the Gouldsborough tannery amounting to more than $100,000, and had done so only on the assurance that he would always have enough hides flowing from the merchants to cover this debt. Sometimes I feel like I'm writing an episode of Succession. As well, Gould added somewhat darkly, there were also his own notes to Loop and Lee for hides that needed to be covered. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to pay them. By the summer of 1859, Jay was dealing almost exclusively with David Lee, because Loop, by now, was talking to the walls. He was off. Starting in July, Loop, according to witnesses, had descended into outright hallucinations. An elephant in his living room, a vampire bat on his shoulder, and he displayed symptoms of paranoia as well. He believed, probably with reason, that his friends were spying on him at this point. He also became convinced that detectives from the New York City Police Department were following him wherever he went. And he decided, without benefit of diagnosis, that he suffered from heart disease. The unwilling leather merchant and lawyer Lee seems to have been supremely concerned about spreading the Loop firm's position too thin with regard to the Gouldsboro tannery. Throughout June and July, Lee became so agitated about Gould's insistence on operating the plant at maximum capacity that he offered to buy Jay's share of the concern for $20,000, an offer Jay flatly refused. Before counting with an offer to buy out Loop and Lee instead. Unwilling to take Gould's note and unable to convince Gould to leave, Lee instead rectified his and Loop's chief conflict with Gould by arranging for another leather dealer, Boston's John B. Alley, to replace them as supplier for the Gouldsboro tannery. They would still sell the tanned hides for Gould, but Gould would buy the sides from the other broker. And thus they wouldn't have the double risk in the transactions. So by the autumn, only one dispute remained between Gould and his two partners in the swamp. Lee insisted that the firm's interest in a large supply of hides delivered before John Alley entered the picture be protected. Jay in turn told his partners he considered the hides collateral for all the paper he'd endorsed for Loop and Lee over the past 9 months. What complicates this is they all have valid positions. Everyone is acting honestly, but there's a conflict. Gould and Lee were still negotiating this impasse, politely arguing back and forth in carefully worded letters that October, when the next and perhaps inevitable shoe dropped. On October 5th, a Wednesday, Loop spent most of the day in his Ferry Street office, sporadically dealing with some small business matters, but mainly complaining to Lee and to several secretaries about his terrible health, his faithless associates, his numerous unnamed enemies. After work, Loop walked uptown to his home on 25th Street, where he ate a silent dinner with two of his three daughters. Later on, William F. Cook, one of a dozen or so friends who had lately taken turns dropping in on their troubled associate, stopped by and was invited to share a glass of ale. When Cook lifted his glass and made a toast to Loop's health, Loop buried his head in his hands, and then he looked up forlornly and with what Cook described later as an unnatural expression. Cook said it was genuinely spooky, just the way he looked. Cook then acquiesced when the agitated Loop asked if he would please spend the night. And Cook said, okay. A few hours later, as the guests chatted with Loop's daughters in an upstairs sitting room, a wild-eyed Loop suddenly rushed in his nightclothes. The daughters were by now quite used to their father's outbursts, and so they didn't comment when Loop embraced and kissed each of them with tears in his eyes before turning briskly away and stalking back out the door to his own bedroom. A few minutes go by. A shot rings out. Running to the sound, Cook and the girls find Loop lying on his bed, blood pouring from a wound in his chest, and a double-barrel pistol on the floor. And he died very quickly. Poor father shot himself, Laura wrote the following morning. It was not his fault. He was insane and has been for some time. He has intended it for a long while. I don't blame him. Testifying before an inquest on the afternoon of October 6th, the very next day, David Lee talked at length about his brother-in-law's, prolonged mental degeneration. And he stated categorically that there was nothing in the facts of Loop's personal, family, social, property, or commercial condition that would lead one to think that he would commit suicide. He wasn't going broke. He wasn't about to be disgraced in the newspapers with some, crime or, it was just that he was out of his mind. Now, just like the Pratt affair, Loop's suicide is yet another chapter of Jay Gould's life that several generations of biographers, fixated on demonizing their subject, have gotten utterly wrong. The popular, spurious version of the story lays the blame for Loop's suicide squarely on Gould. And to make the economics fit the tale being told, it changes the year of Loop's death from 1859 to 1857 because you need the panic of 1857 to square the circle in the spurious version. As the story goes, Gould, while creating two-name paper, had begun speculating wildly in hides, attempting to corner the market just before the panic of 1857. Then in the midst, bear in mind, Pratt was still the partner in 1857. Loop wasn't anywhere near this. Then in the midst of the 1857 collapse, Jay supposedly left Loop a ruined man, holding the bag for hundreds of thousands of dollars in sharply devalued hides and leather. And this, yes, you guessed it, led to Loop's suicide. According to, I'm going to name a few particularly egregious biographers here. According to the version propounded by Richard O'Connor in his mistake-riddled biography of Gould, the panic of 1857 caught Gould, quote, short in his gamble on leather futures. Meanwhile, Charles Loop was learning that he had not only invested in the Gouldsboro tannery, but his name and credit had been used to finance a corner on the hide market, unquote. Other biographers, Warshaw, Josephson, Hoyt, to name just three, have Loop and his bookkeepers descending on Gouldsboro, at which point Loop supposedly discovered not only his gross liability for Gould's failed speculations, but also large discrepancies in his books. Now, it's interesting, you take these two stories which offer the Pratt story and the Loop story, they often appear in side by side in the same biography, completely contradicting each other. Who was his partner in 1857, Pratt or Loop? Pick one. But anyway. And Charles Geist, who in 1997 wrote a well-reviewed book entitled Wall Street, A History, published by Knopf, wrote, when the panic of 1857 occurred, the hide market collapsed and Gould lost nearly everything. Word of the collapse soon reached Loop, who hastily went to confront Gould. The younger man simply shrugged off the loss, which had bankrupted both of them as bad luck, unquote. And biographer Hoyt, using vivid details taken from thin air rather than from the official coroner's inquest record, which exists, wrote that, quote, "On leaving the train after his visit to Gould, Charles Loop took a cab to his Madison Avenue mansion, walked in the door, marched into his library, not his bedroom, his library, locked the panel doors behind him, picked a revolver out of the desk drawer, put the barrel in his mouth, and pulled the trigger, sending a bullet through his brain. All this happened in the summer of 1857, when Charles Loop gave himself to history as the first notable ruined man to choose death by his own hand rather than public dishonor." Hoyt didn't even have, poor old Loop dying in the right room of his man. 30 years after Loop's 1859 suicide, a fairly grim Gould who, was sick of being asked these questions about Loop and being blamed in uninformed gossip for Loop's death, snapped at a reporter that Loop, quote, was a victim of his own demons and nothing else, unquote. Lee and Gould, for about a year or so, went back and forth negotiating the terms on which they would either proceed or conclude their partnership in the Gouldsboro plant. In the end, it seems like they were both content to walk away from the whole thing. Eventually, Gould sold his share to Lee for $1. Because Gould by this time was getting started on Wall Street, and he had much bigger fish to fry, and he was sick of dealing with, he was out of the tanning business. He had discovered a new girlfriend. And Lee shortly closed the operation too, and liquidated the lands. And all that remains is the township of Gouldsboro. And so those are just two examples of tales of Gould's villainy that are representative of other tales I could tell you if we had a few months to spend here. So thanks. And any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
There's a mic.
Yes. What explanation, if any, did Gould give Zanuck when he moved the brokership from his son George to Loop's firm?
Mm-hmm. He explained to Pratt that he believed he could get better terms.
Not from his son?
Yeah, because the son was sort of, the son was acting as if he had sort of something of a monopoly, as he did. Mm-hmm. So he was, and Gould legitimately said, look, my concern is Gould and Pratt. I'm managing this business, and it's best for this business that we change brokers. Your son George is not a partner in Gould and Pratt. I am. So that and that was all a part. That was during the period when Gould was starting to. I think you could almost say he was intentionally doing things that he knew Pratt wouldn't like. The honeymoon was over. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Oh, hi, yeah.
The term somebody is acting loony, does it come from this?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Or is it Looney Tunes from Disney?
Probably Looney Tunes, or maybe it predates that. I don't know. Loopy would be, Loopy would.
Loony comes.
Hi.
Is this working? Yes. Loony comes from Luna, the moon.
Oh, you're right. Right. Yeah, how it affects. Yeah.
But if we would diagnose somebody as acting loopy,
That's different, yeah. That's true, we can use.
Although I'll add one more thing. Although Gould only met Pratt briefly, starting in 1852, he had to have been aware of Pratt as a local figure well before that. And in the late 1840s, on a regular basis, as in every Sunday, Gould would bring his sister Anna, his younger sister Anna, in a coach every Sunday from Roxbury down to Wyndham, where Anna was sweet on a Methodist minister. And for about a year, every Sunday, and they would have gone right, you know how to get from Roxbury to Wyndham, right? They would have blown by here regularly. And Anna did wind up marrying her minister, whose last name was Howe. I forget his first name, Howe. So she became Anna Gould Howe. And
H-O-W-E.
Howe, yeah. And they spent most of the rest of their lives out in a very harsh and barren, empty part of North Dakota as missionaries to the Native Americans. And Gould, would stop there, when he was going cross country. He always annually he did cross country trips on his railroads he was, hands-on manager. If he was anywhere near him, he'd stop. And he would, they lived out there in very rough conditions, but he gave them anything he could, to make it a bit easier. But you couldn't do much to make it a bit easier. Now, an interesting PS, so when he was young, John Burroughs had a huge crush on Annie Gould, okay? And years later, so old Minister Howe eventually kicks the bucket, after 40 years, 50 years. And Annie Gould Howe winds up retired out to California, Southern California, because, now she can finally sort of relax and, enjoy, her nephews and nieces. Jay was dead, but her nephews and nieces made sure she had anything and everything she wanted. And in his later years, Burroughs started spending his winters in Southern California. And they always saw each other all those years later. They hadn't seen each other for decades, but when he was out there, they always got together and hung out. And he, he wrote about it, in his journal. He said, I had a great time today with Annie Gould Howe. I think it was platonic since they were both in their 80s, but, Hi.
I have a question. Do you believe you had access to primary sources
Oh, yeah,
that
totally.
other biographers did not?
Yeah, I did. There's the Gould, the biggest cache of Gould papers is at the New York Historical Society. And most of those were not available to most other biographers previous to me, because they only came to the Society in the last 20, 25 years. Okay.
From
The family. It was very useful. Helen Gould, the oldest daughter, shortly after Jay's death, wanted to make sure to get the record of Jay's life correct. And so she went and she took any and all of his papers that she could find and saved them, archived them. And she hired a guy to, I forget his name, a journalist, to go and interview everybody who had known Jay from this size to the day he died. And those who the fellow didn't interview, she had them write a reminiscence, business partners. But John Burroughs submitted to an interview with this fellow, the book that she envisioned, she was going to hire somebody else to write it based on all this material, but it just never happened. She never, but she saved all the stuff. And then a nephew of Jay Gould, Henry Snow, I think his name is Henry Snow, wanted shortly after Jay died to write sort of a vindicating biography because this dark when Jay died, preachers and ministers across the country were recognizing his death with sermons like "Don't be like him, he's in hell now," So he wanted to write a vindicative biography, and he did, and he had left papers too, and that's there as well. But it wasn't well received because it was like the nephew writing, yeah, sure, he loved his uncle, but then also I had enormous help from Kingdon Gould Jr., Jay's great-grandson, who had some material, most importantly, a book that was a document, a privately published book that was court proceedings relating to a case that came up after Jay died, where there was an assertion that he was the father of an illegitimate child who was now coming forward to, claim, his piece of the pie. And the family, the estate, challenged this, of course. And they hired Elihu Root, subsequently to be in TR's cabinet, and to represent them in this case. And it was spurious. It wasn't. He wasn't the father of this. Okay, and it had supposedly happened in Roxbury in 1849 or and so as part of the process of the trial, there was great research done and then sworn testimony given by all of these people, including John Burroughs, who were with Jay in Roxbury then and knew who he knew and who he didn't know and, were there, and I had never seen this book before, and Kingdon had one of the few copies available, and he showed it to me, and it was like a gold mine. very, very valuable in writing about the early years, because they didn't just talk about this subject, they talked about the whole milieu of growing up in Roxbury and who was friends with who, and, and what Jay's demeanor was when he was 12, and, all sorts of stuff. It was very useful. Kingdon was a great help. And happily, he was very satisfied with the book. I'll tell you a funny story about Kingdon. So after the book published, Kingdon, I guess he had a lot of people hitting him up for free copies of the book for some reason. Well, you're rich, give me a book, And he found it annoying. So my publisher sold Chinese translation rights for the Gould book, and a Chinese edition came out, and I thought he'd get a kick out of it, so I sent him a copy, of the Chinese edition, And he called me up. He said, "Where can I get these? Everybody from now on who asks me for a book, I'm gonna."
That's great.
I'll tell you one more funny Gould story. This is the story I was going to tell you, but I'll tell everybody. When the Gould book came out, I did an event over in Roxbury at Kirkside Park, a beautiful spring day at Kirkside Park, and there was a big crowd of locals, and and it was a fun time. And one of the stories I told was this, and it was something that I had discovered somewhat randomly, going through diaries and general household notebooks from Lyndhurst and from the Fifth Avenue mansion. I deduced that Gould had very large personal libraries at both residences. And he was a real bookish dude. He actually, some of these guys had books, for showpieces, but, Gould was a bookish fellow. And anybody on the staff of either of those houses had carte blanche to use Mr. Gould's library. Any scullery maid or whatever, whoever if you want to use the library, use the library. Now, bear in mind, Jay Gould was the guy who bootstrapped up from nothing, so he had a certain respect for people from all walks of life. In fact, often more respect for people who were struggling or working class than for some of the people he dealt with up here. And through letters and just piecing things together, I could see a trend. Like he kept a logbook, and Sadie Miller, if you want to take the book, just put your name in the book and what book you're taking, just so I know, and then when you bring it back, just cross it out, whatever it was. And looking at that, and now I'm looking at general correspondence, and then a year or two into Sadie taking a bunch of books and returning them, I see, Sadie being sent to nursing school by Mr. Gould. And what I realized was that he sort of used this method to triage people who maybe, exactly. And this happened, I was able to put this together a number of times. And so I told the story. And like I said, we were in Roxbury. This old lady, she looked like she was 420 years old, okay? This old lady stood up and says, "Jay Gould sent my grandfather to veterinarian school." I thought that was so cool. Yeah.
Primary source.
Yeah, there's a primary source. Yeah, exactly.
Was he a farm boy?
Yes, Jay was raised on a dairy farm in Roxbury on up West Settlement Road, in Roxbury, not far from the Burroughs farm, Burroughs homestead. And he and Burroughs knew each other well as kids and young men. Jay was not, Burroughs was always nostalgic for farm life. Jay was not. Although another interesting story, at his home in Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, there was a big, spread of maybe, 200 acres or something, it was big, spread. And not anymore, but it was a big spread. He raised cattle there. He had herds of, and really fine, specimens of beef, And one time when he was visiting, in his later years, he would come back and visit Roxbury. He'd come up in his private railroad car, and they'd pull it up on a siding of the Ulster and Delaware Railroad, and he often brought some of his children, would, hang out in Roxbury, for a few days, visit cousins, And it's interesting, these Pinkerton men who went with him everywhere, when he was in Roxbury, he sent them away. He said, I don't need you here. I'm home. I'm good. But anyway, so he's back in Roxbury this one time, and he takes his kids to visit this fellow, Peter Van Amberg, who had been the hired man on the old Gould farm, 1,000 years before. And Peter now had his own farm. And Peter took Jay around and gave him a tour of his farm. And I think they had lunch at his house. Peter's another one of these guys who wrote a memoir for Helen. That's where this comes from. And at the end of it, as Jay was leaving, he said, "Now, Peter, you will have to come and see my farm. I want to show you around my farm." And Peter, who was very stingy, said, "Well, it's an expensive trip, the train, and I've got so much work here." And Jay said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you come and visit me at my farm, I'll let you pick your choice of any beast from the Lyndhurst herd, and you can have it." Sure enough, a week later, Peter in his Sunday best at Lyndhurst, and Jay was delighted to see him, and they had a good little visit. And then Jay said, "Now I have to go down to the city to tend to some business for a few hours. I'm going to leave you here with Mr. Ferdinand Mangold, who was the landscape artist and the fellow who ran Lyndhurst, the grounds. He's also the man who designed Kirkside Park for Helen in Roxbury. I'm going to leave you here with Mr. Mangold, and he'll take you out into the herd, and you pick whatever animal you'd like. And I'll see you when I get home." So a few hours later, Jay returns and he comes into the house. He finds very happy Peter Van Amberg sitting there in the big living room, and very unhappy, kind of pissed off Ferdinand Mangold sitting across from him. And Jay says, "Well, Peter, did you pick the animal the animal you'd like?" And Peter said, "Yeah." And Jay says to Mangold, "Well, what did he pick?" He said, "He picked the finest bull in our herd." And Jay said to Peter, he said, "Peter, you were always a smart one, I'll pay the shipping and I'll give you the pedigree papers. And well done. No, that's about all I have.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.